Good morning, CTS. Today's scripture reading comes from 2 Samuel, and I've tweaked it a little bit. I changed my mind. I'm allowed to do that, I think. Right? Maybe? Okay, maybe you won't get me uninvited. But we're going to read the entire chapter. 2 Samuel chapter 6. Reading from the New Revised Standard Version. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the son of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the ark. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark. And he died there beside the ark of God. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah. So that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" So David was unwilling to take the ark of the Lord into his care in the city of David. Instead, David took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. It was told King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in my own eyes, but by the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. David has spent the better part of the first book of Samuel being a fugitive. See, David was anointed as next in line for the monarchy after God handed Saul the pink slip for his disobedience. As a result, Saul, who was Israel's first appointed king and David's father-in-law, has been chasing after David day and night, trying to kill him. You got to eliminate the competition. David has been hiding in caves, scrounging for food, faking having a mental illness to avoid capture and the death by his enemies, taking odd jobs here and there, and at one point, even joining forces with Israel's arch nemesis, the Philistines, and he was ready to march on Judah. It can be said of David that desperate times call for desperate measures. I'm sure there were moments when being anointed by the prophet Samuel in his living room in Bethlehem felt like a dream deferred. Perhaps he wondered if it wasn't all but an honest mistake, some misunderstanding between the prophet and God. He got the wrong person here. How many dark nights of the soul did he go through on his way to God's blessing for his life? So one can understand why David would throw a party that rivals Brazil's Carnival. When you make it through stuff that you thought was gonna kill you, that you thought would end you, that you thought would foreclose a more hopeful future for you, I can see how joyful celebration is in order. And at the same time, there's something a bit disconcerting about the nature of David's celebration. First indication that something is not quite right, that something is amiss, is the fact that David ordered 30,000 troops to march to Baal, Judah, to fetch the Ark of the Covenant. This is somewhat odd given that in the first book of Samuel, he had managed to outmaneuver and survive Saul's attempts on his life with but a few hundred men. Seems a bit like an overkill, don't you think? It is as if he thinks there's some sort of national emergency at the border, as if he fears that a caravan of Philistines or Amalekites will ambush him and steal the ark from their midst. The parallels are just coincidental. Might these be the seeds of paranoia within David? Could it be early signs that David, having reached the highest seat of power in the land, is now looking to preserve it at all cost? Power does seem to beget power. You know, why is it that some people get their breakthrough and then they try to keep others from getting theirs? I'll say it again. Why is it that some people get their breakthrough and then try to keep others from getting theirs too? I got my civil rights. You get your own. Another indication that something is not quite right is the fact that on the first attempt to move the ark, David appears to ignore the specific instructions on how to transport the Ark of the Covenant. The instructions were that the Levites needed to purify themselves before carrying the ark. The ark was not supposed to be carried on a cart pulled by oxen, but on the shoulders of God's people. If those were God's instructions, it begs the questions of why did David decide to do his own thing? Is this his unchecked ambition trying to cut corners to ensure that Jerusalem, the newly minted city of David, becomes the epicenter of all political and religious life? In my original text, it says in the verses that we skipped today, but I actually read them. That portion of Uzzah is a difficult passage. Jeez, how do you metabolize that? Good intentions were punished. But I think that this part of the story suggests to us what can happen when poor leadership is at the helm. The story says that Uzzah, a member of David's entourage, reached out to steady the ark, but was struck dead by God. As moral and spiritual leaders, we must remember that our lack of preparation, our impatience, our lack of mentoring, our pressing need for results, our quick pursuit for resolution, our temptation to offer simple answers to complex situations and questions can have dire consequences for faith, the faith and well-being of those we love and lead. As moral and spiritual leaders, we must always keep in mind that it is our task to invite others to experience the power of God, a power that always beckons us toward transformation. And as Father Richard Rohr says, transformation almost always feels like death. So when God is in the midst, something might just die. Our ego, our pride, our need to be right, our need to control the narrative. So after some technical difficulties that resulted in Uzzah's untimely death, David gets rid of the ark like a game of hot potato. Fearing that God was not on his side, he handed it over to the house of Obed-Edom, which was located in a region mostly occupied by the Philistines. But some time passes and David catches wind that the house of Obed-Edom was being blessed by the ark, and so David wants back in. So the party is back on verse 12. This time around, though, David seems to have learned his lesson. He reflected. I do CPE. We reflected, new action, right? See, Levites are bearing the ark on their shoulders. Check. Music blaring through speakers. Check. Slow-cooked barbecue ribs. Check. Shouting and dancing with all their might. Check. You can almost hear it again. Celebrate good times, come on. According to the text, it seems like David's got moves like Jagger. It is this dancing with recklessness, abandon, that has been the subject of many sermons and songs. In fact, I remember one of my favorite songs growing up was, si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo danzo como David. Si el Espíritu de Dios se mueve en mí, yo danzo como David. Yo danzo, yo danzo. That would get you sweating. You would work up a sweat. When the Spirit of the Lord comes upon my heart, I will dance like David danced. It is a subject of many songs. So this dance of David has come to be regarded as a powerful display of self-denial, of total surrender to the will of God, of basking in the joy of the Lord. This is David saying to all that are watching, I'm going to do me. I'm going to get my praise on regardless of what you all may think or say. You all don't know how hard it is to run a kingdom, to keep the lights on, to pay the rent. I have been through too much to get here, and I'm not about to stay in my pew sitting down as if God's hand has not been with me every step of the way. I'm going to dance. And still, I can't shake this strange feeling that something is not quite right with this picture. David seems to talk a good game. The worship seems inspiring. He's a great warrior out in the field. He's a great administrator. He seems to be a man after God's own heart. But just can't put my finger on it. You know, I always took from liberation theology the whole notion of the preferential option for the poor when you're reading Scripture. Reading Scripture from the underbelly, from those who are marginalized. I am reminded of the words of the great James Baldwin when he said, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all the time." We can say that to be an immigrant in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all the time. We could also say that to be poor in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all the time. We could also say that to be part of the LGBTQ plus community and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all the time. We could also say that to be a convicted felon in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all the time. We could say that to be a woman in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all the time. I say this because in today's text, we have a relatively conscious woman, Michal, who has been relegated for far too long as the nagging, critical wife of David, who was spiritually nearsighted, spiritually immature. She just didn't get it. For far too long, she has been gaslighted with arguments that defend a patriarchal, patrilineal, dog-eats-dog system that leaves the most vulnerable silent. Speaking truth to power, Michal has become an unwanted critic, an inconvenient truth, or as Professor Rufus Burrow used to say, a social and moral gadfly, just pestering. How easy it is to dismiss someone when we have not heard their story, when we have not walked in their shoes. See, we must not forget that Michal was Saul's daughter, of whom is said to have loved David. Interesting piece of trivia. The only woman that is said directly to have loved a man in the Hebrew Scriptures. It probably is important, I'm not sure why. It was Michal who had enough sense to catch wind of her father's plot to kill David, and in an act of courage and love for David, helped David escape through a window. Michal chose to be loyal to David, even at the risk of her father finding out. In one fell swoop, she loses the family she had in Saul and the family she had hoped to build with David. David never returns for Michal. He doesn't text her, does not follow her on Instagram. For all intents and purposes, Michal is forgotten. David is said to have married other women and starts a family. If that's not enough, Saul gives Michal away to another man who is said to have loved Michal. But then Saul dies, and David, having risen to power, sends word that he wants Michal to be returned to him because, after all, he purchased her with the foreskin of 100 Philistines. Now, can we begin to imagine the pain that Michal has experienced at the feet of this oppressive system? Can we see the despise beginning to brew in her heart? I would like to suggest that Michal's contempt towards David is informed by the fact that she knows the story. Huh? She has seen this movie already. She witnessed firsthand her father, the king, morally deteriorate in his pursuit of power and wealth. She saw her father's attempts to dress up his political ambitions, investments of religiosity and purity. She saw how unchecked power can lead to paranoia and to the tragic death of your siblings. See, Michal could see through her father's intentions, just as she could see through David's spiritual ephod. See, Michal is not a nagging spouse. Ironically, she is playing the role of prophet in her rebuke of David. It's not the bitter Michal, but the prophet. She knows that God did not want a king to begin with. That God just gave in like a parent gives to a screaming toddler. Here's your sucker. See, the one who was not on the festivities had enough perspective and discernment to call BS on the whole thing. Michal can see through the empty promises and the hollow displays of piety. Now, my question to you and to myself: are we listening to the Michals in our midst? Because even this ivory tower can become an oppressive system. Can we see through the whitewashed tombs and call them what they are? Can we see that a watered-down hate crime law is not really a law that leads to justice? Can we see that a new $570 million community justice campus is making more room in which to incarcerate people and does not do much for the 6 families that were gunned down this past weekend? 6 homicides in 24 hours. Can we see that developing prime real estate oftentimes does not do much for food deserts in our most impoverished communities? Can we see that when beloved members of our church vote to deny ordination based on gender identity or sexual orientation, it's not just about upholding the inerrancy of Scripture and tradition? Friends, the text ends on a difficult note. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. It would be very easy to think that Michal's barrenness constitutes a punishment, either for shaming David before the household, or for her insufficient faith and respect and reverence for the ark. However, the text does not give us full license to label her barrenness as punishment from God. Surely, given the bleak prospects of a woman with no children in the ancient world, her destiny could be considered a damned one. I wonder if the text is telling us today that standing up to death-dealing systems of oppression will cost us something. To not lie down at the bed of capitalism, ethnocentrism, heterosexism, patriarchy, xenophobia might just leave us barren. to be about the work of the realm of God, much will be required of us. Standing by the window and seeing is not enough. We must come down from these protected places that we have in our lives and be willing to risk our significance for the sake of the least of these among us. May the Lord add a blessing to his word.